species. Their skin, skull, claws, and canine teeth are traded as trophies and talismans. Tiger meat is consumed as an exotic treat. In Malaysia, Royal Belum State Park has been a primary target for poachers. Here, the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF Malaysia, found a snared tiger and recorded the horrors of the poacher's trade. Experts from the Department of Wildlife and National Parks rushed to the scene. Could the tiger be saved? When a tiger falls into a trap, it is extremely confused and shocked. It will lash out at the trap that has ensnared it, but the more the tiger pulls on the snare, the tighter the noose becomes, biting down into the skin and bone as it fights for freedom.
Hi, a very good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming. Just a quick introduction before we get the session started. Um, just to introduce the breakout session we have today, it's very much focusing on the innovation for banks. And as you can see, if I can, okay, the Slido is up here. Maybe it's to let everyone to first get on the Slido and get the questions ready. This is the panel that we envisage will have the most questions. Innovation for bank. Not only we have more challenges, but now we need to think of innovating in challenging times for banks as well. So I think one of the key things is we want to talk about what are the implementation focus on the view of innovations and approaches to transition when it comes to the banking sector. Now, before I kickstart, we have a few slides to share, but I would like to first very much introduce our very esteemed three panelists, right? So the first one we have on our far left, she needs no introduction, but would like to formally introduce her as well to those. So Luann is the Group Chief Sustainability Officer at CIMB, and congratulations on your award on Monday. And she is in spearheading the transformation towards sustainable finance and responsible banking for Asia. So she chairs the CEO Action Network Malaysia's working group and is part of the expert advisory group for voluntary carbon markets initiative. Now, with vast experience in sustainability, strategy, transformation, and change management, Luann has diversified expertise in the financial services, consulting, and has co-founded a startup. She possessed the BA and also co-founded and also masters in manufacturing engineering from University of Cambridge and a master in liberal arts in sustainability from Harvard Extension School. So thank you very much for being on this panel. Now we have Priya. Priya, thank you very much for flying in from Singapore. She heads the Sustainability Solutions Group at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation in Asia Pacific, from Singapore, steering the regional ESG goals. Now, previously, she led the EY ASEAN Sustainable Finance and ESG Solutions, managing diverse ESG-focused relationships and frameworks. Now, before EY, she also founded sustainability consultancy Aquabaleno, partnering with institutions like Imperial College London on carbon research. So her sustainable finance passion grew from 17 years tenure at Goldman Sachs. Specializing in risk management, Priya has credentials from Cambridge University, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, and Singapore Management University in Sustainable Finance and Business, and a BSc from University College London. So the third one is really, needs no introduction as well. We have Encik Rafi Hanif. This is actually the group CEO of MBSB Holding, overseeing MBSB Bank and MIDF Group. Before this, he led the group transaction banking at CIMB until June 2023. With over 25 years of banking tenure, Rafi has held leadership roles at HSBC, ABN AMRO, Fajar Capital, Citigroup, and was the CEO of HSBC Amanah Bank and CIMB Islamic Bank. So as CIMB Group Chief Sustainability Officer and CEO of CIMB Foundation, he prioritized sustainability as a core strategy for the group. Now, Rafi studied law and Islamic law at the International Islamic University Malaysia and completed his Master of Laws at Harvard Law School. So we do have three very experienced, I would say, in this field, and it's really important that we hear from you. But before we start, we have a few slides to set the scene, if I may. So first and foremost, if we look at what we are seeing here, there is a need, and everyone is fully aware there is already a need on transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And this is actually 2 years after the first virtual conference that we have conducted for JC3. Now, with that, 2 years ago, I remember working with Luann tirelessly for that session. We were very much pushing for capability building, and it was a very intensified training for all the financial institutions, including bank, asset managers, as well as insurers as well. Now, 2 years later, we are seeing that everyone has fully caught up, and they now want to see how do we then intensify and be smarter when it comes to solutioning and navigating this. So one key takeaway is we definitely want statistics as we move forward. And we are actually looking at, when transitioning, how are the different countries play about when it comes to the generation mix. So if we look at the next slide, these are the 4 critical areas that we are also seeing driving the race to net zero. So definitely the first one is really everyone's looking at allocating capital away from carbon-intensive activities. But the question is how? Second is really increasing capital availability to activities that will enable the transition. Third is to promote resilience and risk management for those impacted by transition and physical risks, and influence adaptation to net zero businesses and consumers. So these are where we are seeing the core tenets as we set the scene. Now, if we look at why this is important, everyone will say that if we don't do this, are we going to lose out on capital and human workforce? All these will start to go to competition. Now, definitely, we are seeing the big bets are clean energy transition, circular economy models, sustainable urban development and transport models, productive and regenerative agriculture, and the rest is really on healthy and productive oceans. So we do see key thematics in the real sector industry that financial institutions can really aim and focus within the region, and especially for Malaysia. Now, when we talk about why is it so difficult and challenging for banks, these are the 5 key barriers and challenges that we observe. And it's very much important that we tackle in today's panel because it will help us to have a very frank and direct conversation how to navigate. So really, the first one is really integration of ESG into the risk management framework. Every organization has that, but to what level of effectiveness is part, that's also critical. Second is really elimination of greenwashing, having the common standards for ESG disclosure, which we know that Australia, 2 days ago, have just issued their ISSB as a standardization. Malaysia SC has also spearheaded and will come up with what that standardization look at. We also talk about common taxonomy, and last but not least is having that embedded into the workplace as a BAU or business ethics as well. So these actually just provide an outline is when we talk about financing historically and where we are now, we've advanced to dedicated purpose financing. We've also gone into having the general purpose, but we also have transition financing, and there are trade financing, and all these are the various tools of financing to consider. And different banks or financial institutions are at different level and different strategy in navigating this capital. So when it comes to what are the areas of eligible green projects, I just want to give everyone a view that for every sector, there are critical projects to aim for. Renewable energy, everyone's most familiar with the solar, wind, biothermal. Low carbon transport, whereby a lot are going for EV infrastructure, but very much also looking at potentially the high-speed rail, the ECRL, all this. And then we have the water, green buildings, land use, and marine resources, water pollution. These are the critical areas that will allow projects to be eligible if done correctly, and we can navigate the eligible green projects for green financing. So of course, this part outlines the example of transitioning activities. So it gives you the really fields of play for every sector that if they want to participate, no one is left behind. So we have the iron and steel, whereby they talked about hydrogen-based reduction, direct reduced iron, and we talk about electrolysis, electrification of their equipment, very much also looking at carbon capture. Whereas for material efficiency, you can see that there is a switch from coal to gas, although it's debatable that that's not green enough, but it is all within the realms of transitioning. There's also blended alternative materials, which I think we'll cover in this panel. There is also for transport, shipping, rail, considering not just alternate fuel switching, but also at the rail side like hydrogen play. So we have the low emission fuels, we have the electrification, and we have the bioenergy, which everyone else is also fairly familiar. So with that, very much of today's focus, while it is considering the transitioning, we're going to cover the environment component. So this is the last slide that I have, but it very much shows like in the realms of the wealth asset management, capital markets, wholesale banking, consumer banking, and insurance. There's a number of chapters or fields of play that bank can really navigate. Of course, 2 hours, we're not going to get the strategy out from our 3 panelists of all these areas. But it's good that everyone start to think about in your avenue and the banking space, where are the areas you can make most impact and also drive the decarbonization within the ecosystem. So maybe first and foremost, before we kickstart, we actually would like to invite a sharing session from the 3 panelists. So the first one, I think we have Priya, if we can actually have you to share. We hear quite a number of efforts are being done from Sumitomo, and you've taken the liberty to put forth a couple of slides. So if I can pass this to you, we'll be happy to hear you, and then we'll take the Q&A as we go through.
Thank you so much, Rina. Oh, you want to hold on to this? I've got one. Oh, all right. Thank you. Okay, great. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I have a few slides, but I know we have time. But I'm going to race through the first few slides because I want to just give you a little bit of information about who we are at SMBC and kind of what we do. I hope I'm going to get this clicker going right. Okay, so SMBC, we're Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. We're a Japanese bank and we're headquartered in Tokyo. I, as Arina mentioned, am based in Singapore, and we cover sustainability solutions across APAC, so really ex-Japan. And I wanted to share this slide because I really believe, and I think many of us do in this room, that it takes a whole community of effort to get it going, right? And so SMBC are part of multiple initiatives and alliances. We're part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance Towards Net Zero. We're part of the Principles of Responsible Investing, TCFD, and so on. So many of our wonderful peers actually who've been here over the last 3 days are part of these memberships. And I think it's important because as SMBC, as a global bank, we do share a lot between what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the US, and in the Americas, and across, of course, in Japan, and of course, across Asia. Because we're continuously learning and understanding, what are the latest technologies, what are the solutions, what are the new innovations, and this is something that is deeply important to us. I think that's it, right? Yes, okay, sorry, it's hard to see the slide from here. So in terms of different innovations that we see around the world, we also make an effort to kind of broaden what our sort of traditional product set is. And some of it is to do with partnerships. And so Carbon Places is one of the carbon market platforms that we've actually invested in. And so we are keeping a close eye in terms of how the carbon market is going to evolve more globally with sort of, evolving regulations and frameworks. I think there was a great session yesterday around the VCM market. We're also looking at supporting and financing startups and climate technology, right? Through our Remarkable Ventures Fund and also through our Asia Rising Fund and our Innovation Center here in Asia. We also invest in a company called Persephone, which is a carbon accounting platform to help our customers really with the software that is needed to help them identify and capture their emissions data. We also partner with a number of other carbon accounting platforms and introduce them to our customers. Our Japan Edge is something that we're very proud of. We love to introduce and business match and partner with those customers that we have deep relationships with in Japan and the solutions and technologies that they have available to us globally. And then lastly, and I wanted to point out Genius, which is one of our investee banks, BTPN in Indonesia, has a Genius platform, which is really a financial inclusion platform for those sort of underbanked in Indonesia. And this is something we plan to expand more broadly as well. I mentioned about sort of the Japanese technologies, and we'll talk a little bit more about transition finance later. And when we're particularly in the energy space, we see huge opportunities, and we were just talking about it earlier in the room, that could potentially really leapfrog and accelerate our journey to net zero. So we're looking at gas turbines, gas engines, co-firing, liquid air energy storage, you name it, CO2 capture. And some of this is very hotly debated, and our team spend a lot of time researching and analyzing, what are the various kind of solutions out there. But we're very happy to match and introduce those Japanese experts and customers that we have. Now, I know the topic and the title is innovation, and I wanted to share this because our sustainability journey at SMBC really started 20 years ago in our first participation with UNEP FI. And it's definitely been an evolution, and it's very much accelerated in the last few years, but I think it will continue to grow. And I think innovation for us is also internal, in terms of our internal understanding and awareness and the partnerships that we build. So we continue to expand on that over the next, we expect that will only increase over the next coming years. But now I'm going to kind of go into the more technical stuff, if that's all right. So we have a net zero 2050 commitment as Sumitomo Financial Group and as SMBC Bank. And so I'll just walk you through the left-hand side of this. So in 2023, we disclosed our mid to long-term targets for our Scope 3. Scope 3 is our financed emissions portfolio. As a bank, our Scope 1 and Scope 2 is important to us, but is nowhere near the size and the quantum of our Scope 3 financed emissions portfolio. Some of you know that SMBC is an energy bank by history, and we've done a lot of energy financing in the past. So our financed emissions portfolio is sizable. And we're really committed to doing everything we can to make sure we hit our net zero target. So by 2030, we will achieve net zero for our Scope 1 and 2 emissions globally. By 2040, we aim to have a zero balance for our loans in the coal space. And by 2050, achieve our net zero Paris-aligned commitment. Now, when we look at the right-hand side, the chart, we have various policies. So we do not support any new or expansion of existing coal-fired power generation. And that includes sort of existing thermal coal as well. And we don't do any project or corporate finance for coal by 2040. We don't want to have any left. And in terms of our net zero roadmap, we have, as of last fiscal year, targets for 3 key sectors. So that's oil and gas, power generation, and coal. And we have disclosed what our baseline numbers are for 2020, and we are sharing what our targets are for FY 2030, in order to sort of show progression to 2050 as well. And I think, TPT and others presented over the last few days, when we talk about, how transparent we are in our transition plan, this is part of it. So this is our sort of external view. Internally, we have targets annually, and by region, and even by department. So we take this extremely seriously in terms of how we manage down our financed emission portfolio. And the targets that we have a range, and the reason why there's a range is because of the sort of geographical diversity of our starting point. So our starting point in APAC is significantly higher than our starting point in some other regions, and so this sort of range looks at really our global picture as well. Okay, let me continue. Now, in terms of sort of our roadmap, we have, I've covered some of that in the previous slide, but what I wanted to mention, I'm really excited about, is our 50 trillion sustainable finance commitment. So we aim to spend 50 trillion yen, which is about $350 in sustainable finance by 2030. So in the next 7 years, we have a lot of work to do, and we know the financing gap is huge, and we aim to really do our part in fulfilling that. The target was actually 30 trillion last fiscal year, and we've done so much in 1 year, we realized actually we can be much more ambitious, and we raised that to 50 trillion. And even within APAC, we can, if you talk to some of our team at our booth, we can share some examples of where we've really kind of increased that number. One of the things I want to mention here, and I think Luan may also talk a little bit about it later, is setting targets in different sectors. So we shared our sector targets for oil and gas and coal and power generation. This year, we're in the process of target setting for steel and automobile. And next year, our fiscal year 24, which starts next April, we will be setting targets for the remaining. We are part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and together with the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we're on the same page in terms of being able to do that. It's really hard, and so we have to look at our entire portfolio and figure out what does that mean for us, and what does it mean, most importantly, to our customers and how we support them through their transition journey as well. Right. And the way we do this is through our range of sustainable finance solutions. This is pretty broad, and it definitely gets quite innovative when we deepen the look in from a sectoral perspective, right? So we look at, as Arina mentioned, we look at sort of use of proceeds products, whether that's green financing or social financing. We also offer green deposits, which allow you to sort of, ensure that your deposits are allocated towards green projects. We offer sustainability-linked, general corporate purpose type of financing, which we know is very popular in the region. And we also offer transition products, right? So transition finance is now already 14% of our portfolio in APAC, and it's something that we expect to be doing much more in the future. And strategically, our team spend a lot of time just really walking through with customers, understanding where are they on their sustainability journey, what do they need, what are the frameworks, best practices, who can we partner them with to make sure that they get every support they need to transition within their sector. And so that comes through in a sort of advisory space in terms of helping set frameworks, sustainable finance frameworks, and also looking at how we can pair them up for the right financing solution, depending on the product that they actually need. And I'll share some case studies. So one thing we're really excited about is we were the first Japanese bank to launch a TNFD report. And I know today's theme has been a lot around nature and biodiversity. It's a start. We have a long way to go. It's really hard. But nature is something that we're definitely looking at integrating much more in terms of our investment opportunities, but also in terms of how we risk manage. I know we have some friendly regulators in the group also really looking at how we look at capturing the risks around nature and biodiversity. I'll share some case studies, though, which talk a little bit about innovation, right? In India, we did a social loan with Shriram Finance. And this was great because it was sort of multifaceted. It talked about energy in terms of EVs, women-led entrepreneurs as well, and also sort of rural communities and underrepresented communities in India. In Indonesia, we supported PLN, the largest sort of utility company, with a green loan. In Malaysia, we did a sustainability-linked loan with Intercontinental Specialty Fats. And in Vietnam, we did a social loan as well as a social loan framework for VP Bank, which was really great, and it was, again, very female-focused and had a strong diversity lens, as well as looking at entrepreneurial digital transformation and other aspects. When we look at sustainability, it's important that we look at the whole picture, and we talk about just transition. And I think that's deeply important to us, that we're looking at a whole economy adjustment, and so we try to offer products that really speak to the need there. And then lastly, in Thailand, we recently launched a sustainability-linked trade finance product, which really looked at the sort of combination of efforts looking at sort of emissions reductions and sort of waste recycling and also electricity usage. So we quite like that because it was very specific to Indorama's needs, and we could tailor that product quite uniquely. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about energy transition. There's so many different component parts to energy transition, and I think transition means so many things to so many people. I think if we think about the number of times it was said in the last 3 days, transition means, the internal transition towards our corporate net zero. Transition means our transition of our mindset, transition of our economy, our people. And so what I'm talking now is really about the energy transition. And I know we have the NETR in Malaysia, and I want to share how SMBC really approached this. So left to right, our research analysis is critical. So we have a team of experts. We have a team of 12 in Singapore who manage this across APAC, and we rely on our global teams for a lot of insight. And we look at taxonomies, we look at new policies, we look at what's happening in the JC3, what we're hearing from JC3 and other committees that are happening around the region, and what regulators are discussing in terms of what's on their mind. We look at, what is the goal, right? So how do we stay ahead of the curve to make sure that we are best equipped to support our customers through that? And then lastly, what is our competitive advantage in that market? And how do we, work with partners in the local market, both on the corporate side and both as in the financing side. And that includes looking at blended finance options. So working with the multilaterals, working with regulators, working with others to make sure we are providing kind of a very holistic approach. In terms of transition strategies, we evaluate companies' strategies for credible transitions in sort of multiple facets. So we look at their public disclosures. Public disclosures are very important, as we've all heard and know. But also we really engage very, very deeply to understand what are the internal challenges and struggles. We know that there's a time lag between what is really happening today in the customer's plan and idea and vision with the reality of what's in their disclosures. And sometimes it's nearly a year behind. And so we use that information to actually really help us evaluate what is the real struggle. And it's not just about the financing gap, it might be capacity building and people, it might be many other things. We also look at the credibility of their strategy, their net zero strategy. And there's so many different ways that we evaluate that, and we also look at the financing in itself. So is the financing in itself at the asset level a transition asset? Is the company credible in their journey towards sort of net zero and 1.5 degree alignment? Do they have science-based targets? Have they cooperated with other partners to sort of demonstrate their engagement in the industry that they're working in as well? And we support the clients in terms of improving their strategy as well. And we continue to figure out what is their need in terms of accessing finance in the international capital markets, because we can see the tap tightening, right? We talked about all these sectors that are going to have targets by many GFAN banks. And as the tap tightens, it creates a sort of liquidity challenge. And I know the regulators are worried about that from a sort of financial risk perspective. So what is the role that we can play to make sure that our customers can still access international financing by developing very, very credible transition strategies? So supporting them through that. And then lastly, I want to talk about coal and the managed phase-out effort. SMBC are part of the GFAN's working group on managed phase-out of coal. I think Yuki may have mentioned that briefly in yesterday's session. And what it is really about how, in Asia Pacific in particular, we have over 2,000 coal-fired power plants that contribute to, I think, 7.2 gigatons of emissions per year, which is about 20% of global emissions annually. So the coal contribution to emissions from APAC is so significant that we really want to mobilize international finance and domestic finance and solutions to really tackle and incentivize the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. This is extremely difficult, and it's very complex, and it requires multiple stakeholders, and I will talk about that more later as well. All right. And then I want to just touch on human capital and the just transition part, because we have to bring everybody along with us, right? And I think one of the important kind of areas to consider are sort of threefold. One is there are going to be declining job opportunities in carbon-heavy sectors. So what does it mean from a reskilling and retraining perspective? And we look at this when we're looking at potential opportunities. What are the options available to them in the country? Some are government-led, some are committee or working group-led, some require actual financing. So can we finance the sort of social side of that energy transition? How do we bridge the gap between the workforce skill set, and what information can we help share to soften that, right, and enable that? And then, of course, addressing energy literacy, right? Just being aware. I think this conference in itself has been a major and massive capacity building effort. And I'm so thankful and grateful to be part of it, because actually addressing that literacy gap for all of our customers is critical. So all of us talking about this regularly helps raise the awareness and understand what is actually needed. And so key initiatives that we see, establishing a green skills taxonomy, developing and rolling out targeted green skill programs, developing and implementing community support programs, and enhancing, of course, energy literacy. And I'm happy to talk more on that. Social finance is a huge part of our ambition and managing our social risks. But and I think we hit like 15%, right, of our portfolio is around social finance in APAC at least. And we've actually developed a new business unit called the Fulfilled Growth Unit within our sustainability department globally. It's very new, but the idea behind it is that if we fast forward to 2050, what does our economy actually look like? We have an aging population, our demographics will kind of materially change. So if we fast forward to that future state, what is actually needed to finance that kind of new world order, if you like? And so that team is starting to develop what can we do more, for our people and socially as well. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about our transition finance framework. So SMBC, this fiscal year, we launched something called the Transition Finance Playbook. It's new, it's evolving, and every year we're going to update it. We know that there are so many different kind of transition finance or transition taxonomies and guidance. Different governments have different views on it. And so what we've done is actually create our own internal taxonomy and playbook that helps us understand and make sure that we are consistent globally to avoid any greenwashing risk, what we are designating and defining as transition finance. So we break it down into, green finance is quite straightforward and there's plenty of it and we all want to do more, no problem. Transition finance is, Luna's like, yes, we need to do it. Is we look at it from two different angles. So if it's a project-specific financing, we look at the project in itself, and we have all sorts of sort of classifications around, is this project actually a transition project, right? Is it going to help this company transition in towards their net zero strategy? If it conflicts with that, then no, it's not a transition effort, right? And then we also look at the country dynamic and the sort of regulatory landscape, and we look at the energy capacity mix and what's actually happening at a country level. This is really important because we see interesting targets, and the team we're currently working on a lot of thematic analysis, both on gas and on coal, and looking at, do we have targets and policies in place for gas financing? Are there policies and plans in place for coal financing? And then what is the renewable and replacement capacity in the renewable energy, and the issues or challenges around transmission grids and land and you name it. So we look at that, and then we of course look at the company in itself. So does the company have a net zero strategy? Do they buy into it? Does it come down from the board? What is it, and how do they actually plan to achieve net zero? And how credible is it? And this is really one of the most interesting and difficult things that we're doing in ASEAN, because it's actually a very new topic for many of our customers. They may have been in this for 2-3 years thinking about their net zero strategy, but it may not be what BP and Shell have had 20 years experience doing, right? So how do we support our domestic and our regional customers in understanding kind of what is needed to be credible in the international capital markets as a net zero plan? And then those combined help us sort of designate what we're going to do. If it's a project-based and use of proceeds-based project, it's typically more straightforward, because it could be, it could be an obvious case. When it's general corporate financing, it becomes quite hard because the parent company level and the entity level structure really matters. Because you don't want finance to be commingled with the investment in new coal assets, right? And we're worried about that also conflicting with our internal policies and the country's own plans and commitments. And so we've just listed out some of the efforts there. It's actually very, very hard to get a transition finance label for what we're seeing in our pipeline. But we have executed close to 10 deals in the region. And so happy to talk on that a little bit more as well. I think I'm out of time.
Thank you, Priya.
Thank you.
With just your one presentation, I probably have 10 questions already. I'm sure between Luann, myself, and Rafi would have a lot of questions on your coal plant strategy and your transitioning framework. Because the biggest question we have now is, yes, it's good to have that, but for example, if you're going to finance just green assets for PLN, what happened to the 237 coal plants that PLN has? Question number one. Now, if they're going to at least fuel switching and ammonia co-firing or hydrogen, would that qualify in your transition finance as well? That's number two. I won't go into that much. I'll pause there, but you'll have time. I would like to take the opportunity for Luann, because Luann also have been looking at coal strategy for a very long time, same for Rafi. But interestingly, Luann has been willing to put forth another sector for our transition discussion today. So I'm very happy for Luann to take the stage. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And actually, it's banks, the global banks like these, that is one of the biggest reasons why I moved to Singapore, to learn from these guys. but Singapore is here now. Anyway, okay, so thanks very much. I'll go quickly into a very specific sector that we've looked at, and it's a hard-to-abate sector. To bring to life some of the aspects of innovation. I think a lot of times when we think about innovation, it's about, okay, what do we do with the green finance specifically, the lending specifically, but actually a lot of time it's not about the pure financial service. In some of the hard to abate sectors, it's mostly not about the pure financial service, but about what else we can do in the periphery. Okay, next slide. First slide. Sorry. Sorry. Right. Okay, so this is our overall roadmap. You've all seen this before probably, and all banks' sustainability strategies look almost the same anyway. But very quickly, what we do internally, what we do with our clients, which is the biggest impact, and what we do with society from a CSR perspective. Now, just zooming into what we do with our clients, because that's really the biggest impact. Whenever we look at working with clients, and this is really all types of clients, whether it's businesses, big or small, and even down to individuals, we do look at the two sides. And our overall philosophy is how do we create net positive impact, or that's the goal, in everything that we do with our clients. And of course, right now we're talking about climate, but that's just one dimension, right? How do you then balance that with other dimensions like human rights, biodiversity, and it's not you can do A minus B because they're different impacts. But this is our overall philosophy. So when we work with clients, we look at two kind of sides of that transition. So how do you get to a net positive impact? First, and in order of priority, the first thing we need to do is we have to try and get the harm or the bad bits or the brown bits down to zero or as close to zero as possible. But at the same time, how do you then create that positive impact? Because if you just focus on minimizing, you'll never get to that net positive, right? You can get to zero at best, but you'll never get to positive. So this is what we do when we look at our clients. And so on the minimizing harm side, and when we come to, when we talk about moving clients, moving the market, yes, we always talk about green finance, transition finance. That's a positive. That is the carrot. But is that going to shift the industry? Unlikely, because that will only get the leaders and the ones who are already looking at transitioning, unless they're there to get the SLL discount. So that's a little bit of a different story. But even then, that is the top half, right? If we really want to get everyone on board, it's about putting in place policies and lending guidelines or financing guidelines, which have a common base across all banks in the ecosystem, and that's really important to move the entire industry so that we don't get leakage. So now on this side, we've got a number of sector guides. Honestly, if you looked at our commitments, they're very similar to SMBC. So climate, no coal 2040, et cetera, et cetera. So how we look at this is we look at first at the transaction level, what is the client using this money for? Secondly, what is the client doing? So the client could be a financing, a rooftop solar, but if they are doing really bad things outside of that, do we want to look at that? And the third is in terms of the portfolio, what are the overall targets? On the positive impact, we've got the usual suite of products, green, social, sustainable, transitioning, et cetera. But it's really about looking at the client portfolio level targets, which is what we're doing at the moment. So, CIMB was the first ASEAN bank to join the NZBA back in 2021, and we have set two targets, two sector-specific targets, which is coal and cement. We set that last year, and we've recently released the transition plans. We've baselined all the key sectors, all the key carbon-intensive sectors, and we're working on a few releasing targets for a few further sectors this year. Now, this is what we look at, when we talk about our commitment. So similar, we've got a 2030 carbon neutrality operations, our internal scope 1 and scope 2 commitment by 2030, and I think that's fairly common. But, as Priya mentioned, that is only a tiny proportion. So of our financed emissions, our scope 1 and scope 2 is only about 0.5% or less of our total emissions. The biggest component is scope 3. So if there are any banks here, I know this is a banking session, so if any of you guys are saying to the public that I have a net zero commitment and it doesn't include scope 3, that is greenwashing, don't do it. Okay, so, or no, actually, quickly go and make a scope 3 commitment because that's where it matters. Okay, so how joining NZBA, making that commitment for scope 3 net zero was a huge, very, very scary step for us because, when we are setting that target, we don't even know exactly how we're going to get there. We don't even have a full view of what is our total scope 3, etc. But it was a leap that we felt that we had to take, and we have, a pretty structured process to get there. And a lot of this is actually thanks to the NZBA and GFANS, because by joining those guys and that group, they would actually help with a lot of guidance, tools, etc. So we actually learned from those, from the global banks and other banks on how to do this. But just very quickly, this is how we look at our target setting for 2050. So first thing is to scope. What is material? What is the most material sectors for us in terms of our portfolio, but also in terms of our financed emissions on a high level, and then going down and actually measuring the emissions from that sector, sector by sector. Now, setting targets is important because it is not about setting an overall, I am overall scope 3 net zero. Which sectors are we talking about and which sectors are going to make the really big difference? And I'll show you later, the sectors make a very huge difference. And the other thing is, it's not about 2050. You know what? We'll all be retired. No, not all. Many of us will be retired, or at least not in the bank, by 2050. So it's really, it's not about setting something far-fetched, long-term. It's about how do we drive action now, starting today. So we do, actually all NZBA banks do set a 2030 target, and that's only 6 years from now, right, to get to that 2030 target and in alignment with the 1.5 degree pathway. Then we figure out how we do it. So I'm going to talk through steps 1 to 4. The implementation part is, it's hard. And in terms of communication, I guess you guys can look at our next sustainability report to see where we are. But I'm going to talk about the target setting and the planned actions. Yeah. So first of all, this is how we first started looking at our financed emissions baseline. Somebody said to me yesterday, sustainability problems are huge. Don't try and eat the entire elephant. Just start with a part of the elephant, a small part, and then you progress. And yeah, so start with a small part and do it in phases. Yeah, don't try and eat the entire thing. So what we started with, so I really like that analogy. But so what we started with was Malaysia and Indonesia, and only on the financing portion, we kind of essentially laid out all our financing exposure from the largest to the smallest within the key 9 carbon intensive sectors, and we targeted to cover the top 70% for each sector. We then used the PCAF methodology, Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. That is, I would say, probably the only one I would recommend, methodology to recommend, and it's officially recognized under TCFD. And then this is the results that you see on the right-hand side. So of our 9 carbon-intensive sectors, you will see that oil and gas, cement, and power, just 3 sectors, make up more than half of our financed emissions. And the reason why we started with coal and cement setting targets, coal is because, well, we had already set a 2040 exit target, so putting a 2030 target was not difficult. But cement was only less than 1% of our financing portfolio, but was 20% of our financed emissions. So it was almost a kind of no-brainer. So this is the problem statement we had when we first started. We know that cement is really important. We know that, it is, but we know that it's a major contributor to emissions. And we know that it's a sector that's really hard to decarbonize. We kind of knew there were some levers like energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, substitution of clinker, etc. But that's how we started. So this was really the problem statement. So what did we do? We went through a 6-step process, and we're doing this for all the sectors that we're looking at. So first thing is we needed to make some key decisions, because it's about not trying to do everything, but really scope down to what are the key parts of the value chain that emit the most and that we have the ability to influence, and has the ability to decarbonize. Then we set the baseline for that particular metric and that part of the value chain, aggregate the financed emissions, see where it goes, right, on a natural basis. So we try and project it forward to say, okay, so if this is this is our baseline, we know that, for example, the electricity sector is going to decarbonize by 2% a year. I'm just making that up, by the way. Therefore, this is the natural emissions reduction for the cement sector. But that will not get us to where we need to go, right? So what are the active levers we needed to pursue? And then looking, and so that's, so item 4 was projecting current emissions forward. That was the dotted kind of peachy line. Then, and this is the hard part, we needed to then select a reference scenario. And the reference scenario needs to be a globally credible scenario aligned with Paris. For cement, it was quite easy because there weren't many, but there weren't many scenarios to choose from, although it was difficult because it was a very tough scenario to start with. So that kind of was a bit of a tough choice. And then the question is, how do we get there? Then it's an iteration, because you need to know or kind of have a reasonable plan to get your clients from line number 4 to line number 5 without killing yourself and without killing the client. So that is really the back and forth to figure out, okay, this is where we need to get to. Is it possible? How are we going to do it? And planning the transition, planning what we're going to do with clients is all part of that. So just looking at the cement sector specifically, and this is diving into a little bit of the nuts and bolts, because we really need to understand the sector in order to set targets for ourselves and for us to know what to do. So it's very quickly apparent when you look at this chart that really the main emissions coming out from the cement value chain is really that whole, the kiln part and the precalcinator to make the clinker. So you can see that it's 479 CO2 kilograms of CO2 per ton of cement or clinker, and 319 is from the burning of fossil fuels to heat that the raw material to make the clinker. So logically, what we then decided was, okay, let's focus our targets on the middle part. And that's what we've done. So these are the first 3 things. First, what is the emissions metric? And don't forget, cement is growing, as in the number of tons of cement required to house the many humans we have, and many humans still going to be born. That is going to increase, and there are going to be more people living in more cities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a matter of like reducing, for example, the amount of cement, or because like for coal you can't, for cement you can't. So we know we need to increase the volume, but how do we decarbonize per ton of cement? So we picked the physical emissions intensity metric. Secondly, we looked at scope 1 and 2 because that were the two contributors to that main process where the most of the emissions was coming from. One is when you heat the calcium carbonate, you get carbon dioxide coming out, and then it creates the clinker, which then gets ground. And the second is from the electricity. Yeah. So 1 and 2 was the scope that we looked at, and again, we limited to that calcination process. Then we added it all up. I'm simplifying here on step 4. And then on step 5, which is the scenario we look at? And this is where you have to get a little bit creative to kind of see what are the possible scenarios out there. There are a number of not a large number, a small number. What I would suggest is go and look at what the other banks are doing. Go and look at the NZBA banks like these guys and see what scenarios they put up. By the way, when you start doing this, very helpfully, a lot of banks have put out white papers. And these are, quite clear documents on like how they've gone through making these decisions, what metrics they're using, what their scope is, etc. So do refer to those. And if you follow NZBA banks, you won't go far wrong. So take a look at those. So for us, what we did was for scope 1, we used the NZE 2050 scenario based on EIA. And for scope 2, because NZE only had scope 1, for scope 2, we used the SBTI SDA sector decarbonization approach for electricity. And these are under the SBTI cement target setting guidance. So these are, so based on this, we had that line that we tried to get to, and that's what it looks like. So putting it together, that's what it looks like. It's a pretty scary trajectory. So we're currently at 0.72, the green dot. We have to decarbonize by 36% a year. This is per ton of cement, yeah? And then get to a much steeper curve later on as we go past to 2050. So how in the world are we going to do this? And this is the really scary part. And this is the part where, you realize that, hey, actually most of it has nothing to do with financing. So first of all, we need to get our clients on board. So the good thing is most of our clients already have some kind of strategy, but they only had a 2050 strategy, not a 2030 strategy. So we have to try and get them to get to our trajectory by 2030. Second is that whole financing thing. Would you put down KPIs? How do you align them? How do you only onboard clients who are in line with your trajectory, et cetera, et cetera? How do we advocate and influence the supply chain? Because you know what? It's not that the green cement guys don't want to the cement guys don't want to make green cement. It's that the developers are not willing to pay more for green buildings and green cement. And why is that? It's because the people who are buying the buildings, like you guys, either in your personal or corporate capacity, are not willing to pay more. So it's a whole kind of systemic issue and chain. So how do we get all the different bits of the ecosystem to kind of play ball to make this happen, right? And you can see the dependencies here on the bottom left. The cement market was what I talked about, but it's also highly dependent on the grid, right? Because they get the electricity from the grid. So if the grid doesn't decarbonize, they're stuck with a lot of things, right? So how do we also kind of advocate for that? And finally, carbon pricing, that would actually solve a lot of things. But yeah, so a lot of dependencies. I hope that I have not kind of scared everyone and given everyone a massive headache. It's a difficult process, but it gives the banks a lot more clarity on what to do, how to do things. And this is the kind of level of rigor that you need to get to really get to net zero. So yes, set that scope 3 net zero target and do it by sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Luan. Very good sharing of the cement sector. And you can almost see that it's as good as having a very good, thorough think through of, congregation of sector expertise in the cement to put together what the value chain looks like, what the emissions challenges looks like, and to really pinpoint where the energy concerns are. But what's more importantly, I would like to, again, from your presentation, there's probably 10 questions coming up for you. But the first thing I wanted to know is, given your journey on here, we still hear property and the construction sector are one of the hardest to abate sector, despite 40% globally of emissions. And the good thing about it is you've tackled one of the key scope 3, which is cement. So kudos for that. But we want to know, as you slice the elephant, right? Do you work in silo, or how do you bring different banks into it to tackle? Someone take the leg, someone take the tail, someone take the arms. These are things where I think we've had very good learnings, but we want to know. Because the next part that we've not talked into is, how do we look at pricing valuation? So that's something I want to come to you. But I'm happy to actually have Encik Rafi. Thank you for letting the two ladies to go first. That's very nice of you. We also want to hear, because Encik Rafi, you've had very vast experience, and now with MBSB and MIDF coming together, there are quite a number of things, exciting things that we see from the synergy. I will not steal the thunder, but I hope to hear from you as well. And thank you for some of the slides that you present. So maybe we'll pass the floor to you, Encik Rafi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for the kind introduction. Given the relative small size of MBSB and our early stage play in the sustainability journey, I have a feeling that I've been included here to meet the gender diversity requirement for the panel. Be that as it may, I've heard from these two ladies all the exciting, innovative things they're doing. And for us, given that we just started the journey, we just disclosed that we will be reducing our scope 2 emissions by 10% this year. So you can see how far we have to go. But before we do that, we thought we should craft our strategy, our sustainability strategy and framework quite tightly, given the limited resources and capacity that we have. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes describing how we are trying to tackle the, I'm always technologically challenged, but here, so if you look at the methodology that we are adopting here, is the common methodology, which is the theory of change. And theory of change requires, number one, to precisely define the problem. If you're not able to define the problem clearly, then the required outcome or target outcome may be quite different from what we have intended. So first is to understand the problem, then to look at what is the intended outcome and impact, medium and long term. And the next is to clearly identify who are the target beneficiaries of the intervention, and to evaluate the intervention to see the causal link between the intervention and the outcome and impact, and also to look at the evidence, how we actually, creating the result. So when we look at the problem itself, today the problem we're facing is a climate change, global warming that is resulting from these high emissions of greenhouse gas. And if you look at the data that's available, today the total GHG emissions annually is about 50 billion tons. So this was a time where the Paris Agreement was put in place, where they wanted to make sure that we don't go beyond a certain threshold. Why 50 billion was created as a baseline at the time was because we found that the average global temperature for the last 150 years was around 11.2 degrees Celsius. And the last 30 years, we have seen probably 8 of the warmest years were in the last 8 years. And if you average it out in the last 30 years, the average global temperature went up to 11.6 degrees Celsius. So it's only gone up by almost by 1.6 degrees Celsius. Last year was one of the hottest years, where we saw the average temperature for that year was already 13.2 degrees Celsius. So that means last year was already 2 degrees Celsius higher than the 11.2 degrees that we had enjoyed in the last 150 years. So coming back to this chart, what it has shown is, instead of reducing from 50 billion tons, we have actually gone up to 53 billion tons in 2021. Despite the slight drop in 2020 because of the lockdowns, globally this number. But at this trajectory, we would be probably hitting 56 billion tons. Is it 56 or 58? 50, I can't see from here. It's about 56. So the target is to bring it down by 2030 to around 42 billion tons, or 46. I can't see it here. Is it 42? I think it's 42. So effectively, we're looking about 25% reduction. Of course, the aim is 45%. But at the current trajectory, I'm not even sure we will be able to hit 25% reduction. And just to visualize, we talk about all these tons and gigas. 1 ton of CO2e, if you want to store it on Earth, you're going to suck it from atmosphere at 15 degrees Celsius. You need about 540 cubic meter space. That's the size of a single linked house in Malaysia. So 50 billion tons means every year we are emitting CO2 equivalent of 50 billion linked houses. Just imagine that. We don't have enough space for that. And if we don't reduce it to 42 billion tons by 2030, we might hit a threshold of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above the global average that we had intended. So that means instead of 11.2 degrees Celsius, we might be at 16 plus degrees Celsius. We have never reached that threshold. That tipping point could lead to what they call the Anthropocene, where you could have a huge dramatic change in climate which could be irreversible. So that's a problem we want to tackle. Now we look at the next slide. Where is this share of this CO2 is coming from? So this data shows, if you look at up to 1920, the European Union has contributed about 57% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. And CO2 lasts for 200 years. Some report says 200 years, some says 1,000 years. So I'm taking 100 years here. So the last 100 years, so from 1820 to 1920, this is the composition. EU, there was no EU at that time, but 28 EU countries at that time contributed 54%. And then you have United States and UK, and Malaysia hardly existed as a contributor. Then coming to 2021, again, United States is the major contributor, followed by European Union, China, UK, and Malaysia's contribution is about, this data shows differently, but it's around 0.8%. So what this slide shows is the G20 countries contribute about 75% of the GHG emissions, and this is not what they emit now or last year or the year before. This is cumulatively being built up over the years, and they have a responsibility for not only this year's emission, but the previous 100 years' emissions. Some of the CO2 get absorbed by the ocean, by the vegetations and forests, but a large chunk of it is still in the atmosphere. So if you look at Malaysia, where we are versus our target, is Malaysia on track to meet its commitment, which is basically not a net GHG emission reduction, but it's actually a carbon intensity of GDP reduction by 45%. There are two different things. We are not committing to reduce total GHG emissions by 45%. Carbon intensity here, if you look at what it means, so the main contributors are energy, industrial processes and product use, IPPU, and then you have agri, and you have waste. These are the main 4 contributors. Energy, the share of energy contribution to the GHG emissions is about 78%, followed by IPPU 10%, and agri is 3%, and waste is 9%. So what this shows is, From 2005, which is the baseline figure that we have agreed, reducing by 45% in 2030, we are seeing in all these sectors there has been a general increase. So energy has increased the GHG emissions by 28%. IPPU, although small, 10%, but it's increased the largest by 118%. And then you've seen waste increasing by 28%, and total is 32% increase. So from 2005 to 2019, we have seen an overall increase in greenhouse gas emissions by 32%. But if you look at the commitment that we have given, the commitment is to reduce carbon intensity per GDP by 45%. What does it mean? This requires you to look at the three figures that I have circled. First is to look at what is the total emission. So if you look at the emission in 2009, Malaysia's emission is about 330 million tons. That's 330 million linked houses. So we have 33 million population, and we are emitting greenhouse gas equivalent to 10 linked houses per person. So if you come back to this figure, the figure shows total GHG emissions, the one circled in one, is 32.12%. But if you look at the carbon intensity, which is emissions per GDP, it is actually reduced by 32%. Because our GDP has increased 95% from 729 billion to 1.42 trillion. So 1.44 trillion, the amount of GHG emissions produced by per ringgit of GDP has actually reduced by 32%. So our commitment is 45, we are at 32, so we are only behind by 13%. So how do we tackle that? That is the problem statement we're looking at. How do we help government to reduce GHG emissions intensity per GDP by 13%? So if you look at where the emissions are coming from, 78% of the emissions is coming from energy sector. And we saw earlier, the energy sector has increased from 2005 to 2019 by 28%. So if you look at the intervention that's required, and this is what we are working on. So we're working on renewable energy. We have raised 300 million ringgit worth of sukuk to invest in these sectors. We've already done solar farm projects. We have also done biogas. Although we are small, I think we're happy to say that 6% of our portfolio, and I'll explain earlier how we have split the portfolio, 6% of our portfolio is already green. And I think we're almost completing the finance emissions. That's the beauty of being small. Small is beautiful. So we hope that we'll be able to complete this exercise and to show that we will be focusing on the key sectors that will contribute directly to government's commitment to reduce carbon intensity per GDP by another 13%. So this slide shows that the key areas to focus on, and this is in line with the NETR, where they're focusing on 6 key sectors. One is RE, which includes biomass, biogas, small hydro, and this doesn't include hydrogen, but this is another area we are focusing on. The other one is EE, energy efficiency, is another area we are focusing on. And the rest, like transportation, oil and gas, we are not a major player in it. So we don't want to boil the ocean. We want to focus in areas where we have influence, and we want to focus on energy so that we can influence the reduction. So whilst it's growing by 28%, but at the same time, we are seeing year on year, there's an 8% reduction. This reduction is a direct result of the government intervention, of course, assisted by various players, including banks, that this, if it continues from 8 to 14% per year, I'm quite confident we'll be able to achieve our 45% target on carbon intensity per GDP. So coming back to this particular approach, what we want is a more top-down approach, where the government comes and says that, look, we have a 45% commitment to reduce carbon intensity of GDP. Our run rate is 32%. This requires the government to come and articulate what is the projection, because carbon intensity has the numerator and the denominator. we need to have a clear idea of where these two, the variables are moving. Because if the GDP is growing from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion, and the growth is coming from low carbon intensive sectors, then we may not need to aggressively shift to renewables. Some may not agree with me, but that's a commitment we have given, right? So the point is we need to have a clear idea where the GDP growth is happening. And to be fair, we are measuring GDP on constant prices, not on current prices. So it doesn't matter. Like last year, current price is 1.72 trillion, but constant price is 1.5 trillion. So if you look at the top-down approach that we need from the government side, it's a clear articulation on where the GDP is going to grow in the next 7 years. What is the estimate GHG emissions per year, a forecast, and where these emissions are going to come from. So if it's going to come primarily from the energy sector, and let's say energy sector contributes 60% to the GDP growth, then we have a problem. Because you might see an increase in the emissions coming from the energy sector, and the reduction could be much lower. You'll see a negative jaw, as we use in finance. So we want to make sure the jaw is positive, that the reduction or the growth in, so either you reduce the emissions from energy sector, which is 78% of the GHG emissions, or you grow the denominator, basically. If the growth in GDP is happening from low carbon intensive sectors, then you may not need to aggressively reduce the carbon emissions. It might have a wider impact to the global environment, but that's what I wanted to highlight, that our size in terms of the GHG emission in total is less than 1%. So if the G20 countries are not doing enough to reduce 78% of the GHG emissions coming from those countries, then even if you do 200% against our target, it's not going to make any much difference. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing more, but we should do more in the sense that it is in line with our government's commitment. Finally, coming to MBSB, as I mentioned earlier, we are a relatively small bank. 50% of our financing is in personal finance. I mean, we can't really do transition risk there or transition or climate risk analysis there. But on the others, 25% is home financing. Again, we can try to attempt to look at physical risk, but I don't think we can do much transition risk analysis there. What is left is 25% of the book, which is corporate and commercial. And the high-risk sectors are mainly utilities and energy. And this is where we're going to focus on, to make sure that moving forward, if we want to expand into the energy sector, we need to have a clear idea. The sector should be either green, which we have already started on, in terms of solar, hydro, and we need to grow into biogas, biomass. These are the areas we want to focus on. And then the most important thing is to actually allocate the resources for more social finance. Given that our carbon footprint as a bank is very limited, I think instead of trying to focus a lot of the heavy lifting on the environmental side, I think we can do more on the social side. Because as a development bank, we have been, working on developing the SME sector quite aggressively in the last 2-3 decades. We have government funding to support this initiative. So that's where we want to play. How do we create more economic empowerment in the small and medium sectors and make sure in their development, they are developing sustainably? That means they have proper tools to measure their carbon emissions, their waste management, their own social responsibilities, including fair labor treatment, gender equality, and so on. So that's, I think, where 70% of our effort will be going. And these are some examples of sukuk that we have done, 300 million ringgit for our own bank, MBSB. That 300 million ringgit sukuk was 10 times oversubscribed. The total demand for the sukuk was close to 3 billion ringgit or 2.9 billion ringgit. That 300 million has really helped us to channel the funding to green and sustainable projects. We hope to tap this market again to grow. As I mentioned, 600 million of green financing have been done in the last 2 years. Given the size of our bank, it's 6% of our corporate and commercial banking portfolio. So it's a good start. I think we can do a lot more. And I think with MIDF coming in, that gives us a huge opportunity to grow on the intermediation part. Can we intermediate in terms of getting more green sukuk? For example, we did recently one with Nicola Solar. I think that was about 390 million sukuk. And there was another sukuk done for Agroto. It's a first sustainable sukuk for an agri business. And of course, we will continue in capacity building. We have worked with, through MIDF, we have ESG research and thematic and sector-specific research reports, and also other events like Green Conference and so on. But I think, as I mentioned in summary, the focus is to make sure that whatever act, whatever intervention that we are involved in is directly linked. There's a causal link between what we achieve with the government's commitment to reduce carbon intensity by 45%. We have had a good run rate as a country at 32%, and we should try to aspire to be above the 45%, because effectively we are not reducing our net GHG emissions. But as I mentioned earlier, there must be some equitable treatment between those who have come late in the game, where our carbon footprint just started probably a decade or two, versus the G20, particularly America, Europe and others, who have been polluting for 2 centuries. And this carbon footprint has been there. It doesn't just go away every year. It's not just replenished every year. It is there throughout a 100 to 200 year period. So US, for example, is committed 50% reduction annual GHG emission. I think they should do minimum 70. And as one of my team members earlier mentioned, there's a report which says that not only they have to reduce by 70%, but they need to fund countries like us to be green, to be more sustainable, in the tune of $530 billion. That is their contribution for all the damage that they have contributed in the past. So I hope our direction is clear. We would be definitely coming up with a more clear strategy on how we can help, but our scope is quite limited, so we will focus in areas where we can have more impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Encik Rafi. I think a very good round of applause for our 3 panelists and the kind of view, the pragmatic issues that we hear. And Encik Rafi, I'm very sure your messages are well heard, and I'm very sure it is something the COP28 delegation have to bring to Dubai in December. That's one key takeaway. Now, I would like to come back to the questions on this focus areas, which is innovating the transition journey. So I do remember my question, Priya. If I can come back to you. When it comes to financing transition, now the beauty of it is, as Luann mentioned, as a more international bank, you actually have avenue on portfolio strategy, choosing and picking the green assets, which is very difficult for financial institutions that have to support national assets. For example, as I mentioned, even for PLN, there are a fleet of coal plants that still have financing to go through. So when it comes to the fact that you're in Malaysia, I have to put you in the spot. So with that, how would you navigate your conversation with the oil and gas and energy player, or for example, utility players? When talking about financing, what would you offer? Pretend that I'm the energy player and I need funding from you. What are the kind of avenue you would allow me to have to enter into the transition finance? Presumably, I only have coal plants.
Great question, and you really put me on the spot, but that's why I'm here. So I think if I take a step back, right, is I talk about the tap tightening, right? And I think that's been fruitful, right? The global agenda and discourse around sustainability and climate risk has been so heightened, and there's so much awareness. But it's very easy to close the tap on funding. It's not very easy to engage and support. And the risk is there's dark financing pools, other financiers who have no objection globally to, continuing to finance very carbon-heavy sectors that we all, are trying to move and progress away from in terms of our financed emission portfolio. So our approach in SMBC is to understand what is the situation today, where do we need to get to, and Luan really well defined the sort of process, right? That really thorough process that we need to go through. So we go through the similar process with each of our customers. So we understand what is the national agenda, what is the national energy roadmap, what is the contribution of that particular company? So if you're asking me the Indonesia question, then what is PLN's role as a state-owned enterprise in Indonesia to provide electricity to a growing population? Exactly, right? And I think Anchik made a very good point around this link between GDP. Now, that's not to say, and I think PLN themselves have been really open and said, yeah, we really need to do this, and we really need to transition. But that has been our mandate, is to provide electricity to the Indonesian population in a very complex archipelago, right? Now, well, our discussion with PLN and with other utility companies is, we need to understand what is the strategy, how are you moving away, what is your investment in renewables, what is your investment in green, and how are we going to do it? And so our loan our green loan that I mentioned on our slide really isolated and ring-fenced that use of proceeds loan that says you cannot use this financing for the development of new coal plants or for any coal financing. It's really got to be for these pre-agreed specified green projects that we believe is the right thing to do because that's how we're going to support PLN to transition. If we took the approach that we're not going to engage with any coal producer, then that means we've turned off the tap. Now, what we are doing is we're turning off the tap because we're not providing new financing to coal, but we want to provide financing to those areas that help them transition. But now there's the gray. And so the second part of your question is around the transition finance. So what we do is we try to understand, with all of our customers in this space, it's extremely hard, is what is it that they need, where is the financing gap for them to transition in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long run? And it really needs to be broken down into those segments. What are the policy enablers or inhibitors today that make it challenging? And Luan made a really good comment around, like, there's so many other things that need to happen outside of financing. And that's very much the case. So in the case in Indonesia and in the case in Vietnam, there's something called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP. And SMBC has signed on to be part of the Vietnam JETP, although we're very close to the Indonesia discussion too, is this huge multi-stakeholder effort, multi-ministerial at a government level, multi-agency in terms of those, there are a lot of donor countries and sponsors who have a vested interest in the topic, private financial institutions, philanthropists, and you name it, and multilaterals, all looking to understand, and in the case of Vietnam, what is the resource mobilization plan? And actually in Vietnam, the JETP document is over 220 pages long, outlining what is Vietnam's roadmap, what is the resource required to be mobilized for eventually this coal phase out, right? Which includes what is the investment needed in new renewable energy, what's the investment needed in the grid, what is the investment needed in biofuels, right? And the analysis that is needed there, and so on and so on and so on. So it goes into a huge amount of detail at a plant level, understanding, are these ultra supercritical plants, what is the age of the plants, and so on. So understanding the kind of the country roadmap is very important. And then lastly, at a customer level or corporate level, does the corporate have a very, very clear net zero strategy? And I think this is really the elephant in the room, and I hate the elephant analogy because I love elephants. But the elephant in the room is that most of generally in ASEAN, corporates do not have a very strong 1.5 net zero strategy.
Exactly.
And I think actually that's why we need to support them, because we can't leave people behind. If we're only supporting the greenest of the green, then that's good, and we will, and there's plenty of people who want to finance the greenest of the green. There's no shortage. I think we have a huge responsibility to play in educating and engaging and supporting and breaking it down into those specific steps that are needed. What is needed in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years, and what is a long-term plan? And I think there's a lot that's needed around the ecosystem in terms of the recourse or the reversing of decisions and so on. I mean, you know, it wasn't long ago, was it a couple of weeks ago, Germany refired up some old coal-fired power plants. And then that puts our Indonesian, you know, coal producers saying, well, if we're exporting coal to Germany, then, you know, how does this feature into the whole dynamic around coal phase-out? So energy security plays a really, really huge part. So I think the way we're trying to take it is very practical steps. Understand that we want to support those customers who actually really have a plan. And we want to help them develop their plan. And we're going to put pressure on them to say, look, we're going to give you transition finance opportunities because we have a 50 trillion target, as I mentioned earlier, but you need to work with us to make sure we actually get there. And I want to see that level of commitment.
Yeah. And that ties in nicely with the Slido first question, Priya. You're not off the hook yet. The first question is for SMBC. So how does SMBC take sufficient comfort that for general purpose loan, the transition plan is aligned and can be considered transitioning or transition finance? If I put it in a very layman, do you first negotiate the efficiency has to be like a certain 5%, 10%? Is it absolute or intensity, emission reduction? Is there a timeline, 2030?
It's complicated. Actually, we have like, was it over 35 points on our question? We have a very elaborate check sheet. And our playbook is also, our external playbook is on our website. You're welcome to look at it and please give us feedback. And our internal version of it is even longer. And it's an arduous process, right? And I have someone in my team here who looks at that. We ask so many questions. We want to understand the starting point and the next point and the interim steps in between. And I mentioned a point earlier around disclosures. So we look at what is the disclosures that they're publishing, but also actually what is the reality on the ground today. And then we look at the data points that they have. And we look at it also at an asset level. So what is the emissions intensity at an asset level? What is the absolute emissions at an asset level? All the data that we can to help us understand really what is the next right step. And I think, you know, the country dynamics I cannot underplay. But also, do they have a conflicting consideration, right? If we're talking about general corporate purposes, and we know that there are new coal plants being built, quite simply, we cannot.
Yeah.
If it's in the same entity, we cannot, because that's completely out of sync with the broader strategy. Even if at a country level, I think that's something that might be the plan. So this is very challenging, and I think that's why we don't have that many that we have executed in APAC. We want to do more, but I think it's an evolutionary thing, because we talk about 2 years ago and 2 years ahead. I think in 2 years' time, we have many more companies who have progressed on that journey.
And that ties in nicely with this question I have for Lu Wen. We talk about valuation, right? So when you think about transitioning and sustainable finance, green finance, and transition finance, right? A lot of the conversation will then come back and, okay, would you finance? Yes or no? But I think from 2 years ago when we started, you know, the JC3 conference to where we are, I think the discussion is also about, it's no longer a yes or no, but it's about tiering. So you probably everyone will start to talk about sustainability performance targets, having a report card when actually you go for financing. So now, bang, here's my report card. What can you offer me? But the negotiation has now, you know, come to a point where it's no longer very straightforward yes or no, but it's very much a tiering of, now if you are a top A grade, you get this. If you are, you know, if you don't meet, you're meeting halfway, you get this. And at some point, if you don't meet, I have to exclude you, and you essentially, you know, to a point where if I start new coal plants, fail, out. So it has gone to that level of sophistication, where I put it very simplified manner. So Lu Wen, what are your thoughts in today's landscape on how do banks navigate this conversation?
Yeah, actually, we're in some. We've got what we call net zero working groups that we are working within to set some of our sector targets. And we're just talking about this today. Somebody asked whether, you know, there will be less capital allocation required, for example, for financing that's green versus non-green or brown. The answer, and my answer to that, is was and is, this was an ask from 5 years ago when I started this conversation to the regulators. Yeah, because if you think about it technically, if you are funding something that is green, it should have, all else considered, right, lower levels of environmental risk, right? Climate risk, transition, etc. Of course, take away the new technology risk and stuff like that, yeah. So by right, there should be, it should be lower risk and therefore attract lower capital, etc., etc. Unfortunately, nowhere in the world is this the case today at a central bank or financial industry level. So then the question that becomes, okay, so if the regulators are not doing this at industry level, what are the banks doing, or how do the banks look at it? So what it is today is that, yes, there are different rates for sustainability-linked products and services. But if you look at pure green or pure social, that's not much of a difference. So today, the reality is it's only on the sustainability-linked finance where you have different rates depending on whether you meet the targets or not. Now, in Malaysia, I've not seen any examples of a step up. So we only see step down. Okay, you meet these KPIs, and I will give you a better rate if you meet. What we've seen other markets doing, especially in the browner sectors, is to say, okay, if you don't meet, your rate is going to get worse. Yeah. So, but this is coming. This is coming. We've been trying to do this with some clients in the browner sectors. But yeah, so the differentiation is generally only on the sustainability link stuff, and it's coming from the pocket of the banks, not, it's not a capital thing. So yeah, actually I wanted to kind of chime in on the transition plan thing. If anyone, because that is a massive challenge, many companies are saying, hey, I've got a net zero commitment, but it doesn't include scope 3, blah, blah, blah. So one of the ways that there's guidance, there's this thing called the Transition Plan Task Force under, I think it's the UK government, because they've made it legislation that all companies have to have a net zero commitment and have a transition plan. So the question is, what is transition plan? They've worked with GFANZ. GFANZ is Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, so NZB is part of that, to come up with a guidance document for transition plans. So how do you evaluate a transition plan? Is it good enough? What's the gold standard? There is a guidance for real economy. There is a separate guidance document for banks. So take a look at that, and that should be your gold standard.
Thank you very much, Luann. Now, we will come back to you, Interim Referee, because we do have questions. So for Interim Referee, how is this emission level measured? To a certain extent, banks generally have difficulty measuring scope 3 emissions. Happy to hear your thoughts.
The quick answer is hire a consultant to do it for you.
Hire consultant.
I mean, the reality is, given the size of our bank, as I mentioned earlier, it's only 25%, which could be measured because the rest is personal finance and home finance, and bulk of the home finance is sub-sale. So the other 25% is only 10 billion ringgit in terms of value. And given the smaller number of customers we have, we were able to use the PCAF methodology to calculate, impute many of these emissions, and were able to come up with a finance emission. But if you're a large bank with a range of sectors with multiple subsectors, it takes a lot of effort. So that's what I say, small is beautiful. But the challenge is, how do you progress from here in terms of developing the more carbon-friendly sectors, as well as to help grow the social finance sector.
Thank you, Interim Referee. I think that's very helpful, because I think what we see in the landscape today, we still talk a lot about transition finance, which is the elephant in the room. But I think we've also, in the coming stage behind the scene, we're also talking about disaster recovery, physical risk, which is already happening to us, if not on a periodic or an annual basis. So definitely for this conference, it still needs more light on innovating, not just from the banking, but the asset managers and the insurance coming together, like to really address. For example, it would be nice to have a conference right after any disaster to see how financial institutions and the real sector players come in and support, for example, the likes of Johor flood, the likes of Kelantan flood. Now that would be a true innovation that actually supports a more sustainable growth moving forward. Encik Rafi, I know you have your thoughts
I
on
had
that.
my thoughts. I mean, this, what you call the climate risk analysis, has both positives and negatives. On the positive side, it helps banks to manage the risk better. But just imagine if you have a house, you live in a flood-prone area, and because banks have now put your area as high risk, and you now want to exit, not because it's flood, but because you want to move to another state, you may not be able to sell your house because banks may not be able to finance the new buyer, number one. Number two, the premium for financing in that area will go up because if there's high risk, banks have to allocate more capital. And premium for insurance will go up. Some insurers may not even want to cover that risk. So when we do, this is why it's important to look at the theory of change methodology. If we are doing all this exercise purely with an outcome of just measuring the risks and not looking at the impact, both positive and negative, it means the theory of change methodology has not been adopted properly. Because we only stopped at one side, that we are managing the risk of the banks, but I'm trying to look on the other side, where how are we managing the risks of those people who already bought those houses? You can't transit them unless the government is going to build a new township and said, hey, migrate to this. So if you don't have a solution, my point is, why do the analysis?
Exactly, and that's very helpful because this is exactly what we've seen for the Sri Muda case, right? And to some extent, the key thing is, as an ecosystem, we also do not want that to repeat again. Now, what you may find useful is, given all these people want data, people want solutions, and the interesting thing is, for large corporates who are in the real and property sector, they can no longer say that I don't know. With all the TCFD requirements coming in, physical risks is something that they have to start mapping. For lands that's not developed, they have to have more enhanced planning moving forward and be transparent about it. So at least that gives the financial institutions some comfort that all the other sectors have no way to hide with the TCFD and ISSB coming into force. That's one point. But I recognize that we have the last 10 minutes, and I would like to at least leave some thoughts for the three amazing panel to share your key takeaway from this conference so that we will stock take in the next session when we meet again. What I have observed is when we come to the transitioning as well, it's important that we see where we are from, at least from Luan's side 5 years ago, Priya for like many years, and Encik Rafi as well. We have learned a lot of lessons. But when it comes to innovation, different financial institutions are still really looking at where would be the most effective area, not just from where have the most impact, but there are also solutionings that hits the masses. So for example, if you talk about transition, the most innovative that we shared about quite a number of years ago is we talked about Korea with issuing green credit cards. And kudos to Maybank, who have already issued a green credit card in Malaysia to really, I know the wish list, although, is to really track the impact and how these behaviors are being incentivized from a very retail perspective, consumer perspective, right? Incentivizing that behavior at the grassroots level. So we also see HSBC have come up with green mortgages. Now, different markets have different considerations on mortgages. It's potentially more effective in countries that have very high energy costs, whereby to decarbonize homes and all, it's a real key monetary issue. Correct. Heating, for example. So these are lesson learned that we've seen different banks, the greens, the reds, the yellows, all have a various innovative solutioning, which I would like to call upon because I think it's a whole ecosystem. We can't eat the whole elephant ourselves. So, I really love that, Luann, and that has helped to really coin, that. But what I wanted to also allow is, from the summary of today's panel discussion, there's 4 key things that I've observed that are really critical, and we have to reflect as not just a financial institution, but a whole ecosystem. The thing is the term of heat. So when we talk about heat, first is human capital. It all starts with our thought process, our knowledge. Regardless of the size of financial institutions, the human capital knowledge is the number 1. Second, economic factor, HE. So economic is always critical, right? In order to drive that. So we also need to make sure that monetary is supporting these policies, right? And then we have the A is the assets. We only have that amount of ability to play with our assets. So we have to be critical which assets we got to mobilize. And the last one is T, technology. So with this 4, I think it's really critical that we actually think about how we, as an ecosystem, come together to see we can have the interplay, not just financial institutions, but the real key sectors, and also the regulators as well. So I would like to invite the 3 panelists to probably share what is your vision, at least in the short term, this coming 2 years, with ISSB and TCFD kicking in, and TNFD that will come in biodiversity. What do you think would be a good call to action from your position, not just for financial institutions, but for those that are listening in, which have corporates, regulators as well? So maybe Priya, we'll start off from you.
Sure. Well, the heat is on. I like the acronym. I think I'm going to take up the E part of this, the economic side, right? Because as banks, we're sort of motivated by our returns. There's a lot of sort of historical processes and decision making in banks that hinges upon profitability decisions, right? And I actually think when I reflect on the type of diversification that is needed in the solutions that were needed in sustainability, that also applies to the diversification of the products that we have. So in a high interest rate environment, and being able to be resilient in the macroeconomic and the VUCA world that we're in, is like looking at in a high interest environment, actually green deposits are great. And so customers, okay, wow, I can hit a green, I can actually put my money towards green objectives. I'm getting a deposit rate that anyway I would have gotten on the market, but that awareness comes in, right? The diversification of the kind of assets that we're investing in. We supported the government of Indonesia with a sort of blue tranche as part of their sovereign bond. So looking at sort of a blue or ocean financing is also really interesting. So I think being very creative about the products that we can use traditional products for with the sustainability lens, by understanding deeply the issues that our communities and companies are actually going through. And then I think there was a point around conservation, which we didn't get to talk about, but I think conservation plays a role in that as we look at our understanding of natural and biodiversity risks and impacts. And then, of course, the social side to it. So even if we're looking at personal financing or home mortgages, what about climate resilience and climate adaptation? I think being able to label that better is something that I'd love to see in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Priya. Luann, it's always interesting to hear your takeaway.
Oh dear. So first thing is speed and scale. Rafi's opening slides really kind of brought us back to how dire a situation we're in, how much we need to change in a very short period of time. Now, I know that, people talk about quick wins, people talk about, oh, no plastic straws, but honestly, things are going to get difficult, things are going to get uncomfortable. We cannot go on BAU because if we do, we will get into a situation where we are, contending with disasters. We have to spend money the money that we have on disaster recovery. How then are we going to even think about mitigation? And then that will just cycle and become worse and worse. So we at this point in time, we can still do things that are meaningful. We still have the luxury of doing it, of choices. If we wait or if we content ourselves with doing small things, we're going to get into a really bad situation. So we really have to get off our seats and start doing all these things that we've been talking about. So when you leave this room, go and actually do something, because it's going to be good for yourself, your family, your portfolio. So yeah, go and do it. Don't just sit there and listen to what we have to say.
Thank you, Luann. To sum it up, it's as good as every person listening, if they're able to come up with a strategy to finance a breakthrough, that would be a good lifetime achievement, if I put that simply. If you can do 5 breakthroughs, that's beating more achievements. Encik Rafi?
Thank you. I mean, looking at these, the two banks, the activities that they're doing, the innovation they're bringing to the market, there are a few hundred things that's going on in the market. It's all wonderful, but my belief is the impact of the Pareto principle. And I've seen this is like God is a designer, a programmer who's programmed everything in a certain matrix. It's like if you do 100 things, 20 of it will be the most impactful, or 20-30%. So what I realize is all of us should go back and look at all the things that we're doing and choose the top 20% that which will give us the highest impact, and link that impact back to your own country's commitments. So if we end up doing more on IPPU, for example, or agri, and we achieve a reduction of 50%, and then we let go of the energy sector, which is increasing by, let's say, 3%, it may not get the right desired impact. So I think the Pareto principle is really important. Continue doing what we are doing, but put emphasis on the 20% of the work that's going to give you the 80% of the impact, and link it to the government commitments.
Thank you, Encik Rafi. That ties in very well with the NIMP NETR, whereby it's given us a very good focus for Malaysia. Now, with that, I think we have one amazing panel for the third day of the conference. I really thank all of you who stayed, and we hope that this has helped accelerate where we are positioning-wise. The last thing we have for thanking the organizers is to ensure that all of us take this back and really action upon it. And hopefully the next time we come together, it's not about talking about effort. We're going to talk about impact and outcome. All right, with that, thank you very much and have a good week ahead.